Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Got a story tonight about a man who spent his whole life answering other people's questions about God. He had a verse for every sorrow, a prayer for every wound, a steady hand for every coffin he walked beside. Then death came to his own house, and every answer he had ever given turned to dust in his mouth. What happened in that silent church over the next 40 nights? Well, that is something I have never forgotten. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let me tell you what faith sounds like when it breaks. There were certain voices in Elm Hollow that people relied on the way they relied on the weather or the turning of the seasons. Doc Cartwright's voice, calm and measured, telling you what was wrong and what could be done about it. Sheriff Aldrich's voice, low and steady, the kind that could quiet a room without raising itself. And then there was Reverend Josiah Crane's voice, deep, warm, resonant as a church bell struck at dawn. The voice that had carried the town through 23 years of Sundays, funerals, weddings, droughts, floods, sicknesses, and all the small, unnamed griefs that accumulate in a place where everyone knows everyone else, and no sorrow goes unnoticed. Josiah Crane was 51 years old in the autumn of 1878. He was not a tall man, but he stood straight, and there was something about the way he held himself, shoulders square, chin level, eyes meeting yours without hesitation, that made him seem larger than he was. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and his beard was neatly trimmed, more gray than brown now. And his hands, the hands that held the Bible every Sunday, that rested on the shoulders of the grieving, that folded in prayer over the sick, were strong and steady. They had never once trembled during a sermon. Not once in 23 years. He had come to Elm Hollow as a young man of 28, fresh from the seminary in St. Louis, full of conviction and fire and the unshakable certainty that God's plan was knowable, that suffering had purpose, and that the right words, spoken at the right time, could mend almost anything. The town had taken to him immediately. His sermons were not the thundering, fist-pounding kind that some frontier preachers favored. They were quieter than that. He spoke the way a good teacher speaks, with patience, with clarity, with the assumption that his listeners were intelligent people who deserved to be reasoned with rather than shouted at. His wife, Catherine, had been the daughter of a schoolteacher in Independence, Missouri. She was a small woman with dark hair and quick eyes, and a laugh that could fill a room the way sunlight fills a window. She played the piano, the upright mahogany piano that had been shipped from St. Louis in 3 crates and reassembled in the church by a carpenter who had cursed the entire time. And her playing on Sunday mornings was as much a part of the Elm Hollow church experience as Josiah's sermons. The two of them together were a kind of institution. You could not think of the church without thinking of both. Catherine had died 8 years ago. Consumption. It had taken her slowly, the way consumption always did, giving the family just enough time to understand what was coming, and not nearly enough time to prepare for it. Josiah had buried her in the cemetery on the hill. Silas Cobb had dug the grave, same as always, and the whole town had come. Josiah had spoken at her funeral himself, which some people thought was brave and others thought was foolish. But Josiah had said that if he could not find the words for his own wife, then he had no business finding them for anyone else. He had found the words. They were simple and honest, and they had made half the town weep. And afterward, Josiah had gone back to the pulpit the very next Sunday and continued. His sermons did not falter. His voice did not crack. If there was a wound inside him, he kept it where no one could see it, and he carried on the way he had always carried on. Steady, reliable, present. But Catherine's death had changed something in him. The people closest to him could see it, though they might not have been able to name it. There was a weight behind his eyes now, a shadow that had not been there before. His sermons were still good, maybe even better, because there was a depth to them that came from having walked through the valley rather than merely pointing at it from a distance. But there was something else, too, a careful quality, as if each word he spoke about hope and grace and God's mercy was being tested against something inside him, weighed on a scale that only he could see. What kept him going, what kept the weight from pulling him under, was Ruth. Ruth Crane was 15 years old that autumn, and she was, by any honest accounting, the center of her father's world. She had her mother's dark hair and quick eyes, and her father's quiet steadiness. She helped at the church, arranging flowers, sweeping the aisles, polishing the candlesticks, and she had begun to teach the youngest children their letters on Saturday mornings in the church's back room. She was not loud or showy. She was simply good, in the way that some people are good without effort, as naturally as breathing. Josiah did not speak of it often, but Ruth was the proof he carried. When doubts came, and they did come more often since Catherine's passing, he looked at his daughter and saw evidence. Evidence that the world, for all its cruelty, was capable of producing something genuinely fine. Ruth was his answer to every hard question. She was the sermon he did not have to write. September of 1878 was warm and dry. The creek was low, and the dust on Main Street was ankle-deep by afternoon. Ruth had been helping Mrs. Henderson organize supplies for the church's autumn social when she came home one evening with a headache. Josiah noticed she was pale at supper, but she waved it off. "Just tired," she said, "just the heat." By morning, the headache was worse, and there was a fever. Doc Cartwright came by midday. "Keep her cool," Cartwright said. "Plenty of water. Rest. It is probably just a passing fever." It was not a passing fever. By the second day, Ruth could not stand. By the third day, the fever had climbed so high that she was delirious, calling out for her mother, for Catherine, who had been in the ground for 8 years. Josiah sat beside her bed and held her hand and prayed. He prayed the way he had never prayed before, not the measured, considered prayers he offered on Sundays, but raw, desperate, unstructured prayers that came from somewhere deeper than his training. He prayed as a father, not as a reverend. He begged. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Ruth opened her eyes, saw her father, and smiled. Josiah wept with relief. Cartwright came by that evening and said she was through the worst of it. On the fifth day, the fever returned, higher than before. Ruth's skin burned to the touch, and her breathing went shallow and fast. Cartwright came back, and this time the look on his face told Josiah everything the doctor's words did not. Ruth Crane died on a Tuesday afternoon, the last day of September. with her father holding her hand and the autumn sunlight falling through the window onto the quilt her mother had made. She was 15 years old. She had not finished growing up. She had not finished anything. Josiah sat beside her for 3 hours after she was gone. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not pray. The sunlight shifted across the room, and the shadows grew long, and the house went cold. And still he sat there, holding her hand, looking at her face, and feeling something inside him come apart, not with a dramatic sound, not with a crack or a snap, but with the slow, quiet collapse of something that had been holding weight for too long and simply could not hold it anymore. Silas Cobb dug the grave on Wednesday morning. He put it next to Catherine's, under the elm tree at the south end of the cemetery, and he made it the same depth and the same width as every other grave he had ever dug, because that was the proper thing to do, regardless of the age of the person going into it. The funeral was held on Thursday. The whole town came. Every seat in the church was filled, and people stood in the back and along the walls and outside the open doors. They expected Josiah to speak. He had spoken at Catherine's funeral, after all. But when the time came, Josiah stood behind the pulpit and looked out at the congregation and said nothing. His mouth opened. No sound came out. He stood there for 10 seconds, 15, 20, long enough for the silence to become a living thing in the room. And then he stepped down from the pulpit, walked past the coffin, past the mourners, out the side door, and was gone. Reverend Whitfield from the Methodist Church down in Cedar Falls happened to be visiting that week. He stepped in and finished the service. People said it was a fine eulogy, though hardly anyone remembered a word of it. What they remembered was Josiah standing up there with his mouth open and nothing coming out, and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor as he walked away. The next morning, Friday, the church doors were locked. The curtains were drawn. A note was pinned to the front door in Josiah's handwriting. Services suspended until further notice. That was all. No explanation. No date of return. Just 6 words in a steady hand. Folks talked as folks do. Henderson said it was grief, and it would pass. Mrs. Aldridge said someone ought to go check on him. Cartwright said the man needed time, and people ought to give it to him. Sheriff Aldridge said he would stop by in a day or two and make sure the Reverend was eating. The sheriff knocked on the church door on Saturday afternoon. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. He walked around to the parsonage, the small house attached to the back of the church where Josiah lived, and knocked there. After a long wait, the door opened a few inches. Josiah's face appeared in the gap. He had not shaved. His eyes were red and hollow. He looked at the sheriff the way a man looks at someone speaking a language he no longer understands. "Just checking on you, Reverend," Aldridge said. "Folks are worried." "I am alive," Josiah said. His voice was flat. Not angry, not sad. Flat the way a note sounds when you strike a cracked bell. "You eating?" "Enough. You need anything?" A pause. Then, "No." The door closed. Aldridge stood on the step for a moment, then put his hat back on and walked away. He reported to the town that the Reverend was alive, and that was about the best he could say for it. Days passed. The church remained locked. Sunday came and went without a service. The first time in 23 years. Some families drove their wagons down to Cedar Falls for Whitfield's Methodist service. Others stayed home and read the Bible on their own. A few just sat on their porches and looked up at the church on the hill and felt the absence the way you feel a missing tooth. Not with sharp pain, but with a dull, persistent wrongness. Henderson left a basket of food on the parsonage step every other day. Sometimes it was taken in. Sometimes it sat there until Henderson retrieved it the next morning, untouched. A week passed. 2 weeks. The leaves turned and fell, and the wind pushed them against the church doors in brown drifts. Nobody saw Josiah. The curtain stayed drawn. The note stayed pinned to the door. And then, on the 14th night, something happened. Martha Pruitt, the baker's wife who lived in the house directly across the street from the church, woke at midnight to a sound she could not place. She lay in bed for a moment, listening. The sound came again, faint, muffled, but unmistakable once her sleep-fogged mind caught up with it. A piano. Someone was playing the piano inside the locked church. Martha sat up in bed. The sound was soft, so soft she might have imagined it if it had come only once. But it continued slow and tentative, the way a person plays when they are searching for something rather than performing it. Individual notes at first, then fragments of melody, then a phrase that repeated and shifted and repeated again. Martha got out of bed and went to the window. The church was dark. No light behind the curtains, no glow from a candle or a lamp. Just a dark shape of the building against the night sky, and that piano sound drifting out through the walls like smoke through cracks. She stood at the window for 20 minutes, listening. The playing did not stop. It was not a song she recognized. It was not a hymn. It was something without a name. Slow, aching, beautiful in the way that certain broken things are beautiful. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete that Martha could hear her own heartbeat. She went back to bed and lay there until dawn, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the Reverend alone in that dark church, playing a piano he had not touched since his wife died, and wondering what a man hears when he listens to the silence after the last note fades. The piano playing continued. Not every night, but most nights. Martha told Henderson. Henderson told Aldridge. Aldridge told Cartwright. They stood in the street one afternoon, 4 of them, looking at the church and talking in low voices about what ought to be done. He is grieving, Cartwright said. The piano was Catherine's instrument. He is reaching for something familiar. It has been 3 weeks, Henderson said. The town needs its church. The town needs its reverend, healthy, and whole, Cartwright said. Give him time. Aldridge said nothing. He just looked at the dark windows and thought about the flat, dead quality of Josiah's voice through the crack in the parsonage door. The playing changed over time. In the first week, it was hesitant. Isolated notes, fragments, tentative explorations of the keys. By the second week, melodies began to form. They were not hymns, and they were not songs anyone in town had ever heard. They were something Josiah was composing in real time, pulling music out of the silence the way a man pulls water from a well, one bucket at a time. By the third week, the playing had become something else entirely. The melodies had deepened and grown complex. There were passages of extraordinary beauty, runs of notes that climbed and fell like birds in flight, and passages of such raw dissonance that Martha Pruitt, listening from her bedroom window, would press her hand to her chest and feel her eyes burn. People began to notice. You could hear the piano from the street on quiet nights, and people walking home from the saloon or coming off a late shift would stop and tilt their heads and listen. Nobody spoke while it was playing. There was something about the sound that demanded silence from its audience. Even an accidental audience standing in the dirt outside a locked church at 1 a.m. Sheriff Aldridge knocked on the parsonage door again after 4 weeks. This time, Josiah opened it wider. He looked worse than before. Thinner, paler, his beard grown out wild and his eyes sunken. But there was something different, too. The flatness was gone from his gaze. In its place was something more like searching, an active quality, as if he was looking for something he had not yet found, but had not given up on. "Folks hear you playing at night," Aldridge said. "I expect they do. That piano was Catherine's." It was. "Are you all right, Josiah?" The Reverend looked at the sheriff for a long moment. "I am trying to decide," he said. "Decide what? Whether any of it was true." Aldrich did not ask what "it" meant. He understood. He tipped his hat, said, "Take the time you need," and left. The 35th night. The 36th. The piano played. Elm Hollow had grown accustomed to it the way you grow accustomed to the sound of a clock or the distant call of a train. It became part of the fabric of the town's nights, a strange and sorrowful music that somehow made the darkness a little less empty. On the 39th night, the piano did not play. Martha Pruitt noticed the silence immediately. She lay awake until dawn, waiting for the first note, but it never came. The church was dark and quiet, and the night was hollow without the music. The 40th night was silent, too, and Martha felt a worry that was deeper than curiosity. Silence, after that much music, felt like something had ended, and not in a good way. On the 41st night, a woman walked into Elm Hollow. She came from the east, on foot, carrying a small carpet bag and wearing a dark wool coat that had seen better years. She was perhaps 35, with auburn hair pinned up under a plain hat, and a face that was handsome rather than pretty, strong jaw, clear brown eyes, a mouth that looked like it smiled easily but was not smiling now. She walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had been walking for a long time and had learned to conserve her energy. She stopped at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house and took a room for the night. She gave her name as Miriam Foss and said she was passing through on her way to relatives in Oregon. Mrs. Aldridge heated her a plate of stew and showed her the room. Miriam ate, washed, and was about to lie down when she heard something through the open window. Not a piano. A voice. It was coming from the church on the hill. A man's voice, speaking, not shouting, not singing, just speaking in a steady, broken stream that rose and fell like water over stones. She could not make out the words from this distance, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone arguing, not with another person, with something larger. Miriam stood at the window and listened. The voice went on for several minutes, then stopped, then started. She put on her coat, left the boarding house, and walked up the hill toward the church. The church doors were locked, same as they had been for 41 days. But the side door of the parsonage was ajar, just a few inches, as if someone had pushed it closed without quite latching it. Miriam hesitated. She was a stranger in this town, and she had no business entering a man's home uninvited. But the voice she had heard was not the voice of a man who was well, and something in her, something she would later describe as the same instinct that makes you reach for a child about to fall, pushed her forward. She knocked on the parsonage door. No answer. She knocked again. "Go away," came the voice from inside. Hoarse, exhausted, but still resonant. A voice that had been built for speaking to crowds and was now wasted on empty rooms. "I am not from this town," Miriam said. "I am passing through. I heard you from the boarding house." A long silence. Then, "What did you hear?" A man talking to someone who was not there. Another silence, longer this time. Then footsteps, and the door opened. Josiah Crane stood in the doorway. He was a shadow of the man the town remembered. His clothes hung loose, his cheeks were hollow, and his beard was untrimmed and streaked with gray. But his eyes, those were alive. Painfully, desperately alive, the way eyes look when they have been staring at something for too long and cannot look away. "I was not talking to no one," he said. "I was talking to God, or what is left of him." Miriam looked at him steadily. She did not flinch. She did not offer platitudes. She simply looked at him the way you look at a wound, with clear eyes and no pretense. "And what did he say?" she asked. Josiah stared at her. Nobody had asked him that. In 41 days, not a single person had knocked on his door and asked him what God had said. They had asked if he was eating. They had asked if he needed anything. They had asked when services would resume. But nobody had asked the only question that mattered. "Nothing," Josiah said. Not a word. Miriam nodded slowly. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside. The parsonage was in the state you would expect of a place inhabited by grief. Dishes unwashed, books scattered, curtains drawn. A single lamp burned low on the table, casting long shadows across the room. The door to the church was open. Josiah had been going back and forth between the parsonage and the sanctuary for weeks, and the two spaces had become one continuous territory of sorrow. Miriam did not comment on the state of things. She sat down at the table, set her bag on the floor, and looked at Josiah the way a person looks at a map, studying the terrain, identifying the landmarks, calculating the distance. Josiah sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The lamp flickered between them. "My daughter died," Josiah said. He said it the way a man says the sun rose or the creek is dry, as a fact so enormous and so fundamental that it could only be stated plainly. "I am sorry," Miriam said, not in the reflexive, automatic way people usually said it. She said it with weight, with the gravity of someone who understood what those words were supposed to carry and was giving them their full measure. I have spent 23 years in that pulpit, Josiah said, tilting his head toward the open door to the church. 23 years telling people that God has a plan, that suffering has purpose, that if you hold on, if you trust, if you keep your faith, the light will come. I said those words at my wife's funeral, and I believe them. I said them at the funerals of children. And I believed them. I believed them because I had to, because believing was my job, because if I stopped believing, then what was I? He paused, ran his hand through his beard. Then Ruth died. My Ruth, 15 years old, sweet and good and kind, and everything I had left in this world that made sense. And I stood in that pulpit on the day we buried her, and I opened my mouth to say the words, the same words, the words I had said 100 times, and they would not come, because I did not believe them anymore, not one of them. The lamp sputtered. Miriam waited. So I locked the doors and I sat in that church, and I asked God, directly, face to face, no sermon, no ceremony. I asked him why. Why her? Why now? Why a girl who never harmed a living soul? And do you know what he said? Miriam did not interrupt. Nothing, Josiah said. 40 nights I sat in that church. 40 nights I asked. And the answer was silence. Every single night. Miriam was quiet for a long time after he finished. The lamp had steadied, and the shadows were still. Through the open door to the church, the shape of the piano was visible in the dark, a large, silent presence. You played the piano, she said. Catherine's piano. Yes. Why? Josiah looked at the dark shape through the doorway. Because I ran out of words. I said everything I had to say, and none of it reached anywhere. So I thought, maybe music. Maybe something without words could get through where words could not. Did it? He was quiet for a long time. I do not know, but it was the first thing in 40 nights that did not feel like lying. Miriam leaned forward slightly. Can I ask you something? You have been asking me things since you walked in. One more. When you asked God why, when you sat in that church for 40 nights and demanded an answer, what answer would have been enough? Josiah opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He stopped. The question had caught him in a place he had not examined. He had been so focused on the absence of an answer that he had never considered what a satisfactory answer would sound like. What words could God possibly speak that would make the death of a 15-year-old girl acceptable? What explanation could justify it? What plan could be grand enough to require it? There is no answer that would be enough, he said slowly. Is there? No, Miriam said. There is not. The room was very still. Josiah looked at this stranger sitting at his table and felt something shift. Not the collapse he had felt when Ruth died, but something more like a settling. The way earth settles after being disturbed. Not a fixing, not a healing, just a finding of a new level. Then what is left, he asked, and his voice was not the voice of a reverend asking a theological question. It was the voice of a father lost in the dark, asking someone to tell him which direction the road goes. Miriam did not answer immediately. She looked through the doorway at the piano. "Play something," she said. "Now." Josiah stood and walked through the doorway into the church. Miriam followed. The sanctuary was dark except for the faint light from the parsonage lamp filtering through the open door. The pews were empty. The pulpit stood at the front like an abandoned post. Dust had settled on everything. The hymnals, the windowsills, the brass candlesticks that Ruth used to polish until they shone. The piano stood against the east wall. Catherine's piano. The mahogany was dull now. No one had polished it in years, but the shape of it was solid and certain in the darkness. Josiah sat down on the bench. He rested his hands on the keys, but did not press them. Miriam sat in the front pew, 3 feet away, her coat still buttoned, her bag on the floor beside her. "I do not play well," Josiah said. "I did not ask for well," Miriam said. "I asked for something." He played. It was not a hymn. It was not a song. It was the music he had been building for 40 nights. A slow, searching melody that began in the lower register and climbed, note by note, towards something it could not quite reach. It faltered and returned. It pushed forward and fell back. It was the sound of a man trying to find a door in a dark room, running his hands along the walls, knowing the door is there, but not knowing where. Miriam listened with her eyes closed. She did not move. She did not speak. She let the music fill the dark church the way water fills a vessel, completely, without gaps, without mercy. When Josiah reached a passage that he had played many times, a sequence of notes that rose in a pattern that seemed about to resolve but never did, Miriam began to hum, softly, so softly that Josiah did not notice at first, a harmony. Not a competing melody, but a complement. Something that fit against the edges of what he was playing the way a hand fits inside a glove. He heard it. His fingers hesitated on the keys. Then they continued, and the humming continued with them, and for the first time in 40 nights, the music was not a monologue. It was a conversation. They played and hummed together for perhaps 20 minutes. The music moved through phases: sorrow, anger, tenderness, exhaustion, and finally something that was not quite peace, but was in the same territory. An arrival, maybe, or the recognition that arriving was not the point. When the last note faded, Josiah's hands rested on the keys, and he did not lift them. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the 40 nights. It was not empty. It was full of everything the music had carried and set down. "Who are you?" Josiah asked quietly. Miriam opened her eyes. Nobody important. A woman on her way to Oregon who heard a man talking to the sky and thought he might need someone to talk to instead. You hum like someone who knows music. My mother was a church organist in Virginia. I grew up in a church not so different from this one. I know what a church sounds like full, and I know what it sounds like empty. She paused. This church is not empty, Reverend. It is just waiting. Waiting for what you want to fill it with. Josiah looked at the keys beneath his hands. Ivory, yellowed now, some of them chipped at the edges. Catherine had played these same keys with light, quick fingers. Ruth had sat on this bench as a girl and plunked out clumsy melodies while Catherine laughed. "I do not know if I can stand in that pulpit again," he said. "Then do not stand in it tomorrow. Stand in it when you are ready." What if I am never ready? Miriam looked at the pulpit, then at the piano, then at Josiah. "You played that piano for 40 nights, alone in the dark, with no audience and no reason except that you needed to. That is not a man who has lost his faith, Reverend. That is a man who is looking for a new way to carry it." Miriam Foss stayed in Elm Hollow for 11 days. She had planned to stay one night. Then one became two, because Mrs. Aldridge needed help reorganizing the boarding house pantry, and Miriam had offered. Two became three because the weather turned foul, a cold rain that drummed against the windows and turned the streets to mud. Three became four because Miriam walked up the hill to the church again that evening and found Josiah sitting on the parsonage steps, looking at the sky. She sat beside him. They did not speak for a long while. Then Josiah said, "I owe this town something." "You owe yourself something first," Miriam said. "What is that?" "Permission to not have the answers. You have been standing behind that pulpit for 23 years, pretending you know things no man can know. Maybe the honest thing, the brave thing, is to stand up there and say you do not know, to say that you have been broken and you are putting the pieces back together and you do not know what the picture looks like yet. People come to church for certainty. People come to church because they are afraid. And when they see someone who is also afraid, who has also been broken, who is still standing anyway, that is worth more than certainty. That is courage. And courage is contagious in a way that certainty never is. On the 5th day, Josiah unlocked the church doors. He did not announce it. He did not pen a note. He simply turned the key, pushed the doors open, and let the autumn air rush in. It had been 46 days since the church had been opened, and the air inside was stale and thick with dust. Josiah spent the morning cleaning. He swept the floor. He dusted the pews. He polished the candlesticks, Ruth's candlesticks, and set them back in their places. Miriam helped without being asked. She washed the windows. She arranged the hymnals. She oiled the piano keys with a soft cloth, working each one individually until the ivory gleamed. On the 6th day, Josiah lit a candle in the church, just one. He set it on the piano and let it burn. Henderson's boy saw the light through the window on his way home from the store and told his father. Henderson told his wife. His wife told Mrs. Pruitt. By evening, half the town knew that there was a light burning in the church for the first time in 6 weeks. Nobody came to the door. Nobody knocked. But people walked past the church a little more slowly that night, and some of them paused and looked at the single flame visible through the window, and something in them eased. On the 7th day, Josiah played the piano with the doors open. It was afternoon, and the sound carried down the hill and into the town the way church bells carry, not demanding attention, just offering it. People heard it in their kitchens and in their shops and on their porches, and they stopped what they were doing and they listened. And some of them smiled, and some of them cried, and most of them just stood still for a minute and felt something they had been missing without knowing what it was. On the 8th day, Miriam sat in the front pew while Josiah stood behind the pulpit for the first time in 47 days. There was no congregation, just her. He gripped the edges of the pulpit the way a man grips the rail of a ship in rough water. His knuckles were white. He looked out at the empty pews and then at Miriam. "I do not know what to say," he said. "Say that," she said. He stood there for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I do not know what to say. For 23 years I stood here and I had words for everything. Every grief, every doubt, every dark night of the soul. I had a verse, a prayer, an answer. Then my daughter died, and the words left me, all of them. And I have been standing in this empty church for 40 nights, asking God to give them back, and He has not. So I am standing here now in front of an empty room, telling the truth. I do not know why Ruth died. I do not know if there is a plan. I do not know if any of the things I have said from this pulpit for 23 years are true, but I am still here, and I think that has to count for something." His voice broke on the last word. He lowered his head and gripped the pulpit and stood there breathing. Miriam did not clap. She did not say, "Well done," or "That was beautiful." She simply nodded once, the way you nod when someone has finally said the thing that needed to be said. "That," she said, "is a sermon." On the 11th day, a Sunday, Miriam Foss packed her carpetbag, buttoned her coat, and came down to Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen for the last time. "You are leaving," Mrs. Aldridge said. It was not a question. "I was only passing through," Miriam said. "You have done more passing through than most people do in a lifetime of staying." Miriam smiled at that. The first full smile Mrs. Aldridge had seen from her, and it transformed her face the way sunlight transforms a room. She walked up the hill one last time. Josiah was in the church arranging the pews. He had pushed some of them back to make a wider aisle. For no particular reason, he said, except that the church had felt crowded even when it was empty and he wanted to give it room to breathe. "I am leaving this morning," Miriam said. Josiah stopped what he was doing. He stood with his hands on the back of a pew and looked at her. "I know," he said. "You will be all right. I do not know about all right, but I will be here. That seems to be the important part." Miriam set her bag down. She walked to the piano and sat on the bench. She ran her fingers lightly across the keys without pressing them, just feeling the smooth ivory under her fingertips. "I want to leave you something," she said, "but I do not have much. You have already left me more than you know." She smiled again, smaller this time, and then she began to play. It was not a hymn, and it was not a song anyone would have recognized. It was the melody she had hummed that first night, the harmony that had fit against Josiah's searching music like a hand inside a glove. But now, played fully on the piano, it was richer and deeper and more complete. It moved through the church the way light moves through stained glass, broken into colors, each one distinct, each one part of something larger. Josiah stood at the end of the aisle and listened. He did not sit down. He did not close his eyes. He watched her hands on the keys, sure and steady and gentle, and he felt something he had not felt in 47 days. Not faith exactly, not the old faith, the ironclad certainty that had carried him for 23 years and shattered when Ruth died. Something new, something quieter, something that did not claim to know the answers, but was willing to sit in the questions and find beauty there anyway. When Miriam finished, she stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "You asked me what was left," she said, "when there are no answers, when God is silent. I remember. This is what is left." She gestured. At the church, the piano, the open doors, the morning light on the floor, the music, the showing up, the choosing to stay when everything in you says leave. She turned and walked out the door and down the hill and out of Elm Hollow without looking back. Josiah watched her from the church doorway until she was a small figure on the eastern road, and then she was gone. The following Sunday, Josiah Crane opened the church for services. The whole town came. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, the same as they had at Ruth's funeral 7 weeks earlier. But this time, the air was different. There was no grief in it, or rather, the grief was still there, but it had been joined by something else, something that had enough room for both sorrow and hope to stand side by side. Josiah stood behind the pulpit. He looked out at his congregation, at Henderson and his wife, at Martha Pruitt, at Sheriff Aldridge, at Doc Cartwright, at Silas Cobb standing quietly at the back, at Mrs. Aldridge dabbing her eyes before he had even said a word. "I owe you an apology," he began. "Not for closing the doors. I needed to close them. But for the years before that, the years when I stood here and pretended I had answers I did not have. I told you that suffering had purpose. I told you that God had a plan. I told you that faith would carry you through. And I believed it. I truly did. Until I learned that believing something and being tested by it are two very different things." He paused. The church was silent. I lost my daughter, and I lost my faith, and for 40 nights I sat in this church in the dark and I asked God to give it back. He did not. But a stranger walked through that door and asked me a question nobody else had thought to ask. And the question was this: what answer would have been enough? He looked down at his hands on the pulpit. None. No answer would have been enough. And that is not a failure of God. That is the truth of being human. We lose the people we love, and no explanation makes it right. No verse heals it. No sermon fixes it. What heals it, what comes close to healing it, is being with each other, showing up, sitting in the dark together, and sometimes, if we are very lucky, making music. He stepped away from the pulpit and walked to the piano. He sat down on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. The congregation watched, uncertain. In 23 years, Josiah had never played during a service. That had been Catherine's role, and after Catherine it had been no one's role. The piano had been silent on Sundays for 8 years. He played. The melody Miriam had left, the one that had no name and no words, it filled the church the way it had filled the dark sanctuary on the 41st night. But this time there was light, and there were people, and the music was not a solitary cry but an offering. Martha Pruitt began to cry. Henderson put his arm around his wife. Sheriff Aldridge took off his hat. And in the back of the church, Silas Cobb, the quietest man in Elm Hollow, closed his eyes and listened with the expression of someone who understood, without words, exactly what was being said. The hymn that had no name became a part of the Elm Hollow Church. Josiah played it every Sunday, at the beginning, before the sermon, instead of the opening prayer. Over time, people began to hum along the way Miriam had hummed that first night, adding their voices to the melody without being asked. It was never written down. It was never given a title. It existed only in the air of that church every Sunday for as long as Josiah Crane stood behind the pulpit. And sometimes, late at night, if you walked past the church when the town was sleeping, you could still hear it. Faint, slow, searching. A man at a piano in the dark, playing for an audience of one in a church that was no longer empty. And that is the way I heard it told. A man who had all the answers, until the one question came along that broke them all. And a woman passing through who did not give him new answers. She just gave him permission to live without them. That is a rare gift, friend. Most people want to fix what is broken. The wise ones just sit with you while it mends on its own. The fire is getting low now. You rest easy tonight, friend. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.